The story begins on a dry, windless evening in 1878, when the horizon of Haskell County, Kansas, glowed a dull copper under a sky too still to trust. The locals spoke little of the four brothers who arrived that summer, hauling a wagon creaking with iron tools, old books, and jars sealed with wax. They bought no livestock, spoke to no neighbors, and built their cabin in a thicket so dense even the sunlight seemed afraid to enter. The brothers were alike in face but not in manner, one silent as stone, another quick to anger, the third prone to humming in the dark, and the eldest always writing in a black notebook that no one ever saw open. By autumn, rumors began to breathe through the prairie. Hunters returning from the woods spoke of seeing figures moving in pairs, though only one set of tracks ever appeared in the soil. One settler's daughter swore she saw all four brothers standing by her window at dawn, yet her father had found them miles away, tending their land at the same hour. The air itself seemed to bend around that forest, carrying faint sounds of laughter that turned to crying the closer one drew. When the first man vanished, a farmer named Eli Foster, the sheriff rode to the brothers' cabin. He found the door ajar, a table neatly set for supper, 5 plates waiting, 5 chairs aligned. The smell of something metallic lingered in the air. And though the sheriff called out their names, the woods answered him back, softly, with his own voice. That night, the townsfolk gathered in silence, watching the smoke rise from that part of the forest. No one dared to ask why the fire burned green. No one dared to return. For years, people would whisper about the brothers, about what they unearthed beneath those Kansas roots, and why the ground around their land still trembles after dark. Some said they brought something from Missouri that wasn't meant to live. Others said Kansas had given them something that wasn't meant to die. Whatever truth lies buried there, science refuses to touch it, and the woods, even now, refuse to forget. In the sweltering summer of 1878, Haskell County, Kansas, became the unlikely refuge for four brothers whose past remained shrouded in whispers and fragmented rumors. The county itself was a patchwork of endless prairie, tangled groves, and solitary homesteads, the kind of land where isolation could easily swallow a person whole. When the brothers arrived, dragging their weathered wagon over the cracked, sun-baked soil, the air seemed to shift subtly, as if the wind itself hesitated to move. Neighbors watched from a cautious distance, noting the odd rhythm of their movements, the synchronized gestures that seemed almost ritualistic. There was a sense of purpose in everything they did, setting stakes for a cabin, cutting timber with an almost reverent care, and arranging stones in lines whose significance no one could guess. Each brother was distinct, yet there was an eerie symmetry to them, faces alike but personalities diverging in subtle, unsettling ways. The eldest carried a black-bound journal, scribbling endlessly with ink that darkened unnaturally, while another wandered the perimeter of their claim, humming low tunes that seemed to echo across the empty fields. The third was quick to anger, a flash of temper that startled anyone who caught a glimpse of it, while the youngest often vanished into the woods for hours, returning with strange twigs or stones clutched tightly in his hands. Rumors about their past clung to them immediately. Some said they had fled Missouri to escape scandal, others whispered darker possibilities, of crimes unspoken or family secrets too grotesque to recount. Yet no matter the speculation, the brothers never spoke to the locals beyond necessity, and their presence grew into a quiet, creeping fascination. Haskell County, usually too absorbed in its own survival to notice much else, began to feel the subtle tension they brought. Travelers passing through remarked on the way shadows seemed to linger longer near the brothers' land, how birds avoided the trees around their cabin, and how a low hum or whisper would rise from the forest as evening fell. The brothers themselves appeared unbothered by these perceptions, moving with precise, almost ceremonial routines, building their cabin in the thickest part of the woods where sunlight barely penetrated, digging small trenches or planting unidentifiable seeds, and speaking to each other in a language that none could decipher. By the end of that first summer, Haskell County had not only gained 4 new residents but also an unspoken story that spread quietly from farmhouse to farmhouse, a story that carried the subtle chill of something lurking just beyond sight, something that promised the ordinary world might not be enough to contain the strange, unsettling presence that the 4 brothers brought into the heart of the Kansas wilderness. By the time the first frost hinted at the approaching fall, whispers of missing neighbors began to circulate through Haskell County, and an uneasy tension gripped the scattered homesteads. Farmers and their families would wake to find fences broken, tools misplaced, and livestock wandering, yet the cabins themselves remained intact, untouched, as if whatever had passed through respected the thresholds of human habitation while violating everything else. It started subtly, with a single disappearance. A widow named Martha Greer, who lived on the edge of the woods, vanished without a trace one morning. Her kettle was still on the stove, the fire smoldering, and her children claimed they heard her singing softly in the night, though no one saw her after dusk. Fear spread quietly, infecting even those who had previously dismissed the brothers as peculiar but harmless. Soon, more reports emerged: a trapper's guide who had wandered too close to the brothers' property, a young boy sent to fetch water from a nearby stream, and a small family who had camped near the tree line. Each time, the pattern repeated itself. Doors were found closed, rooms orderly, and personal belongings untouched, yet the individuals were gone. The only clues left behind were strange, claw-like marks scratched into wood, bark, and even soil, deep, uneven gouges that no animal known to the settlers could have made. The marks seemed deliberate, almost communicative, but their meaning was indecipherable. As weeks passed, the fear evolved into a kind of obsession. Small groups of men attempted to track the missing, combing the woods, calling names into the dense canopy, but the forest seemed to swallow their efforts. Tracks would appear briefly, only to vanish abruptly or lead in impossible loops. Animals were found dead, not from wounds of hunting or predation, but twisted as if the forest itself had reshaped them. Townsfolk began speaking in hushed tones about shadows moving at the edge of vision, shapes glimpsed between the trunks that resembled the four brothers, yet distorted in ways that made the human mind recoil. Even those who had never ventured near the brothers' cabin felt the weight of something watching, waiting, as if the woods had become a living entity aware of every intrusion. In the evenings, faint cries carried on the wind, sometimes imitating voices of the missing, other times blending into a symphony of anguish and laughter that left the listeners shivering. Attempts to confront the brothers directly met only silence or vague gestures, and any interaction seemed to warp reality itself. Compasses spun, lanterns flickered, and footsteps that should have sounded nearby remained eerily muffled. It became clear that the disappearances were not random accidents of the frontier but part of something deliberate, calculated, and beyond comprehension, a creeping horror rooted in the very land the four brothers had claimed, a darkness that was slowly claiming the county and challenging the fragile sense of safety the settlers had once believed they possessed. When Sheriff Amos Rourke first heard the rumors of the brothers' strange behavior and the mounting disappearances, he dismissed them as frontier exaggeration, until a letter arrived from a distressed farmer, begging him to investigate. Riding his weary horse through the sun-scorched plains of Haskell County, Rourke felt an uneasy weight in the air as he approached the dense cluster of trees where the brothers' cabin was said to stand. The forest loomed taller than any surrounding grove, its shadows deep and almost unnatural, swallowing light before it could fully touch the ground. As he pushed through the underbrush, the sheriff noticed an unsettling silence, no birdsong, no rustle of small creatures, just the crunch of his own boots on the dry soil. At last, the cabin appeared, half hidden beneath twisted branches, its timbers darkened with age, or perhaps something more sinister. He dismounted cautiously, hand resting on the hilt of his revolver, and called out, identifying himself and demanding the brothers show themselves. Only the wind replied, carrying faint echoes that sounded disturbingly like whispers in response. Entering the cabin, Rourke found a scene that defied both expectation and explanation. The table was meticulously set for supper, each plate perfectly aligned, each utensil gleaming in the weak afternoon light, yet there were 5 places instead of 4, as if an unseen guest were always expected. The air was thick with the metallic tang of iron, and a low, almost imperceptible vibration seemed to hum through the floorboards, a resonance that made the sheriff's teeth chatter. He searched the rooms, calling each brother's name, but found them nowhere, though signs of their presence were everywhere: a partially filled kettle still warm, a candle burned halfway down, scraps of paper scrawled with indecipherable symbols. Rourke's instincts told him to retreat, yet something compelled him to linger, a fascination mingled with a growing dread that made the hair on his arms stiffen. Stepping back outside, he scanned the forest edges, noting tracks that appeared to lead toward the trees, then vanish mid-step, as if swallowed by the soil itself. He realized then that conventional reasoning could not account for what he was witnessing. The brothers, the cabin, and the surrounding woods seemed to exist under rules entirely their own. Returning to town, he spoke cautiously of his findings, careful not to reveal his full unease. Residents pressed him for answers, but Rourke could offer none beyond the empty table and the 5th, inexplicable chair. That night, as he slept uneasily in the sheriff's office, the distant sounds of the forest seemed to carry faint laughter and footsteps echoing his own name, reminding him that the brothers' absence did not mean they were gone, and that the forest, with its shadows and whispered secrets, was already asserting its hold over Haskell County in ways that no lawman, no matter how determined, could fully comprehend. As the days lengthened into autumn, the forest surrounding the brothers' cabin developed a sinister reputation among the people of Haskell County, becoming known simply as the Whispering Woods. Travelers and hunters spoke of faint voices drifting on the wind, calling their names in tones both familiar and alien, sometimes mimicking the voices of long-lost friends or relatives. Those who dared to follow these sounds often vanished, leaving only footprints that abruptly ended mid-path or reappeared in impossible locations, suggesting that the forest itself had become a maze governed by rules beyond mortal understanding. The phenomenon did not discriminate. Children fetching water, men checking traps, and even wandering livestock seemed to be drawn into its depths, pulled by some unseen force. Reports emerged of settlers hearing laughter, weeping, or soft humming from deep within the trees, so convincingly human that families could not resist investigating. Yet no matter how carefully they searched, they found nothing but the cold, still undergrowth. Over time, even the bravest men began avoiding the area, noticing a peculiar shift in the atmosphere as they approached. Birds and small animals vanished from the tree-line, leaving a haunting silence broken only by the wind that seemed to carry voices not of this world. Locals speculated that the forest had absorbed the souls of those who disappeared, trapping them in a half-seen, half-imagined plane of existence where they whispered endlessly. Occasionally, those who returned told stories of disorientation, of time stretching or shrinking inexplicably, and of glimpsing figures moving just beyond the corner of their vision, figures that resembled the four brothers, yet warped in subtle ways that made the eye recoil. Some settlers claimed that the forest seemed aware of their presence, adjusting shadows and paths as if to guide or mislead them. Attempts to map or survey the woods yielded contradictory results. A trail walked one day would vanish the next, trees seemed to shift positions, and landmarks appeared where none had existed before. Fear became contagious, spreading from farmstead to farmstead, eroding the community's sense of safety and normalcy. Children were forbidden to play near the tree-line, and adults crossed the open fields with quickened steps, eyes flicking to the edge of the woods as if expecting the invisible to leap out. The Whispering Woods became a character in its own right, a sentient and malevolent presence that shaped behavior and perception, feeding on curiosity and fear alike. Scholars and itinerant preachers who visited reported headaches, nausea, or inexplicable chills, reinforcing the notion that the forest was no ordinary woodland, but a threshold to something darker, an expanse where sound and space warped unnaturally, where the very air carried secrets meant to ensnare the unwary and remind the townsfolk of the unaccountable, persistent, and growing power of the four brothers who had claimed it as their own. The discovery of the fifth chair came by accident, and it sent tremors of unease rippling through the quiet settlements of Haskell County. It was a schoolteacher named Clara Whitmore, new to the region and curious about the whispered stories of the four brothers, who first noticed it. One afternoon, venturing near the edge of the dense forest to collect wild herbs for her students' remedies, she stumbled upon the brothers' abandoned cabin. Time and neglect had begun to erode the structure, but its interior remained oddly preserved, as if frozen in the moment the brothers had last departed. The table immediately drew her attention. For plates sat neatly arranged, polished utensils lined up with exacting care, and remnants of long-cold food lingered in the bowls. Yet there was a fifth place set at the head of the table, perfectly aligned with the others, as though waiting for an unseen guest. The sight was unsettling, but curiosity compelled her to explore further. Clara noticed a series of journals stacked haphazardly on a low shelf. The pages were brittle, written in meticulous script that sometimes dissolved into strange symbols and sketches of figures that seemed both human and grotesque. As she leafed through them, she found repeated references to a presence the brothers called the Fifth Among Us. The entries were fragmented, cryptic, and unnerving. One passage read, "We did not create it, but it came to us in the roots, sleeping and hungry. 4 is not enough. 5 will complete the circle." Another described ritual-like gatherings around the table, where the brothers spoke in hushed tones to someone or something no outsider could see. The language hinted at a being neither fully human nor entirely of the natural world, a presence that was observed, honored, and feared in equal measure. The fifth chair seemed to symbolize this presence, an acknowledgement of its existence and authority over the brothers' lives. Clara's unease grew as she read of nights when the brothers reportedly vanished into the forest for hours, returning to speak of dreams where the fifth guided them, demanded obedience, or revealed truths too terrible to recount fully. Even the sketches depicted 4 figures seated around the table, with a fifth indistinct shape that seemed to shift, its edges blurred as if resisting definition. By the time Clara left the cabin, the weight of what she had seen pressed on her chest. The fifth chair was no mere artifact, it was a clue, a mark of a reality that defied reason, a presence that the brothers acknowledged and obeyed while the rest of the world remained ignorant. The forest, the cabin, and the journals all seemed to converge toward this concept of the fifth, an enigma that suggested the 4 brothers were not alone in their secluded dominion, and that the mysterious force they revered, whatever it was, had already begun to weave itself into the very fabric of Haskell County, invisible yet undeniably present. It was several years after the brothers' disappearance that the first shocking discovery of unearthed remains came to light, an event that would deepen the mystery and horrify the residents of Haskell County. A group of miners, expanding a small excavation on the outskirts of the forest for a new well, stumbled upon a pit that had been obscured by roots and undergrowth. Initially, they assumed it was an ordinary grave, perhaps left abandoned by the earliest settlers, but what lay within defied comprehension. The soil had been disturbed in irregular, chaotic patterns, as if the earth itself had been contorted to fit the contents it held. When they began to clear debris, bones emerged, though not arranged in the conventional form of human remains. Human bones were fused unnaturally with fragments of animal skeletons, ribs interlaced with claws, vertebrae intertwined with talon-like extremities, forming shapes that seemed almost deliberately monstrous. The miners recoiled, some vomiting at the sight, while others simply froze, unable to articulate the full horror before them. The smell that rose from the pit was acrid and metallic, lingering in the air long after the pit had been covered again. Word spread quickly through the county, carried by frightened laborers and gossiping neighbors, and the story became a cautionary tale told in hushed, trembling tones. No one could identify the origin of the remains. The locals feared that the forest had become a place where natural laws no longer applied, and some speculated that the brothers themselves had played a role in whatever dark experiment or ritual had produced the grotesque fusion of bones. Attempts to study the site further were met with inexplicable phenomena. Tools would bend or break without cause, and compasses spun wildly, as though magnetic forces had gone awry. Researchers and curious townsfolk alike reported a pervasive sense of being watched, and a low humming, faint but continuous, seemed to rise from the pit itself, merging with the rustle of the trees. Animals refused to enter the vicinity, and even the forest seemed to lean inward, concealing what lay beneath. The discovery transformed local understanding of the four brothers from mere recluses into figures associated with a tangible, unnatural terror. Scholars and itinerants passing through noted that the remains could not be classified by standard anatomical knowledge. They were aberrations that challenged the principles of biology and logic. The community began to regard the forest as cursed, a place where reality had been rewritten, and where the influence of the brothers, whether through ritual, study, or something entirely unknowable, continued to assert itself long after their physical absence, leaving behind a macabre legacy that chilled the marrow and reminded all who heard the tale that some mysteries were born not just of human choice, but of forces that might exist beyond understanding, buried and waiting beneath the very soil they trod. In 1881, the unsettling reports from Haskell County reached the ears of federal authorities, prompting a small team of government investigators to arrive quietly, their purpose shrouded in secrecy. They came under the guise of routine oversight, yet those few who glimpsed them noted their faces were pale and drawn, their eyes scanning the landscape with a tension that suggested anticipation of something far darker than any typical frontier crime. The investigators moved cautiously, documenting the forest, the abandoned cabin, and the surrounding terrain with meticulous care, measuring distances, sketching the trees, and taking samples of soil and water. They interviewed the residents, though few dared speak at length, and even those willing to share details often broke down mid-story, as if fear itself had lodged in their throats. Within days, the team reportedly discovered evidence that left them visibly shaken, traces of human and animal remains, deeply anomalous and defying conventional classification, along with symbols carved into the trees and scattered across the cabin floor, suggesting patterns or rituals no one could decipher. One account, whispered among the townsfolk, claimed the investigators found traces of biological material that appeared to regenerate when left alone, a phenomenon that one scientist supposedly described as a violation of natural law. Strangest of all, their instruments, designed for precise measurement, reportedly malfunctioned unpredictably, compasses spinning without reason and thermometers fluctuating wildly even in stable conditions. As they prepared their reports, tension within the group escalated. Some refused to enter the deepest parts of the forest, claiming an oppressive presence watched their every move, a feeling that intensified at dusk and deepened when the moon rose. After less than a month, the investigators withdrew abruptly, their departure as silent and mysterious as their arrival. No official records were ever released to the public, and correspondence regarding their findings was classified, sealed under layers of government bureaucracy with labels citing biological anomaly, unstudied, and hazardous to personnel. Rumors circulated among those few who had contact with them that the team had seen things no human should ever witness, movements in the forest that suggested intelligence beyond animal instinct, figures that blurred the line between human and something else, and the faint sound of whispered voices calling their names, echoing the accounts of locals. The county's residents, left without explanation, interpreted the silence as a warning, an implicit acknowledgement that the forest and the brothers' legacy harbored forces beyond comprehension. Over time, the investigators' sudden withdrawal and the secrecy surrounding their findings became a central piece of the macabre narrative of Haskell County, reinforcing the notion that the events tied to the four brothers were not merely local curiosities but anomalies that challenged science itself, anomalies that authorities recognized could not be safely studied, catalogued, or explained, leaving the land, the forest, and its terrifying mystery suspended in a silence that weighed heavily on anyone who dared to remember the names of the four brothers and the unseen presence that had dominated their lives. Decades passed after the mysterious withdrawal of the federal investigators, and Haskell County settled into a wary quiet, though the forest and its secrets continued to loom over the residents' consciousness like a shadow that refused to fade. Then, one cold morning in the early 20th century, an old man appeared at the outskirts of the town, thin, stooped, and yet somehow bearing an air of unnatural vitality. He claimed to be one of the four brothers, though the years had scarcely touched him. His hair remained dark at the roots, and his eyes held the sharp, calculating intensity of a man much younger. Townsfolk were immediately suspicious, noting the odd cadence of his speech and the careful way he avoided direct answers to questions about the forest or the disappearances that had once plagued the county. Yet what unsettled them most was his insistence that he had returned to warn them about the thing beneath the roots, a cryptic phrase that he repeated over and over, eyes darting toward the tree-line as if expecting it to respond. He spoke of nights spent wandering the forest, guided by a presence that demanded obedience and understanding beyond mortal comprehension, a being that had watched over him and his brothers, shaping their actions and testing their resolve. He claimed that the fifth, the entity the journals had described, was not a creature in the ordinary sense, but a force woven into the soil and trees themselves, something that had chosen the brothers as vessels or witnesses to its existence. As he spoke, residents noted a strange effect in the air. Temperatures dropped inexplicably, shadows deepened unnaturally, and the faint scent of iron and decayed vegetation lingered, a reminder of the unearthly horrors hidden beneath the forest floor. Some who approached too closely felt nausea or dizziness, and animals fled from the vicinity, reinforcing the man's warnings. He recounted incidents of unexplainable phenomena, footprints that led nowhere, voices that mimicked the missing, and objects moving of their own accord. He insisted that the forest remained alive in a way that defied natural law, an intelligence patiently observing, recording, and sometimes punishing intruders. His presence unsettled the county not only because of his strange vitality but because he confirmed the long-held suspicions of many. The events tied to the four brothers were not myths, nor were they merely local tragedies. They were manifestations of something far older, more inscrutable, and far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. As the old man faded into the shadows of the town after his brief, unsettling visit, his words lingered like a whispered curse, a reminder that the forest's influence had not ended with the brothers' disappearance, that the fifth remained beneath the roots, watching, patient, and enduring, and that Haskell County itself had become the stage for a story that neither time nor distance could erase. Years after the old man's return, an itinerant priest traveling through Haskell County stumbled upon a scene that would deepen the mystery of the four brothers and the forest they had once dominated. Following faint trails and strange symbols etched into trees, he discovered the abandoned cabin, now transformed in ways that defied understanding. The structure had been converted into a crude chapel, though its layout was warped, the altar fashioned from rough-hewn timber and stone stacked in irregular patterns, and the walls scrawled with markings that pulsed faintly in the dim light, as though alive. Candles, long burned down to stubs, had been replaced with dripping wax that formed unnatural shapes on the floor, resembling skeletal hands reaching toward the ceiling. The priest's presence seemed to stir the air, the temperature dropped, and a low, almost inaudible hum resonated through the timber and stone, vibrating in a way that made the hairs on his arms stand stiff. As he stepped carefully through the cabin, he noticed that the markings on the walls depicted not just figures of the four brothers, but also indistinct, shadowy shapes with elongated limbs and eyes that seemed to move when unobserved. In some sketches, these figures appeared to emerge from the very roots of the trees surrounding the cabin, suggesting a connection between the forest and the beings the brothers had invoked or worshipped. Among the scattered journals and scraps of paper, he found references to rituals, prayers, and invocations directed at an entity the brothers had called the Fifth, a being neither wholly human nor entirely monstrous, whose presence was central to their existence. The priest could sense the palpable weight of devotion, fear, and reverence embedded in every object, every mark, and every creaking timber. As he lingered, he realized that the cabin was not merely a residence but a shrine, a site where the brothers had communicated with something ancient and powerful buried beneath the forest floor. The forest itself seemed to lean toward the cabin, its branches pressing closer as if guarding the secrets within. Outside, the wind carried faint whispers, echoing words that were almost intelligible, phrases that mimicked the human voice but carried a resonance that was distinctly otherworldly. The priest's hand shook as he touched one of the journals, and for a moment, he felt the pull of something beneath him, a presence rooted in the soil, patient and watchful. He fled the cabin before nightfall, returning to town with a story that no one could easily believe. Yet in the following days, travelers reported seeing figures moving between the trees at the edge of the forest, and locals swore they could hear chanting or whispered prayers when the wind shifted. The chapel and its markings remained, a tangible reminder that the brothers' connection to the fifth had never truly ended, and that the forest, with its roots and shadows, continued to harbor a presence that defied understanding, drawing on human curiosity, fear, and devotion to persist beyond the lifespans of those who had first summoned it. Even as decades turned into a century, the story of the four brothers and the dark forces they had unearthed in Haskell County refused to fade, carried forward by hushed rumors, half-forgotten journals, and the occasional traveler who glimpsed something unnatural in the forest. Among the most perplexing aspects of the mystery was the fate of the remains reportedly recovered from the mass grave near the brothers' property. According to fragmentary accounts, these remains had been secured and transported to a hidden laboratory somewhere in Kansas, a facility said to be under strict government oversight. Yet despite repeated inquiries from scientists, historians, and even journalists, no official records or studies were ever published. Those who attempted to probe the situation further were met with polite refusals, veiled threats, or vague claims that the samples defied classification and posed a hazard to anyone attempting analysis. The refusal of modern science to engage with the remains only heightened the sense of dread surrounding them, suggesting that the anomalies within the pit, the unnatural fusion of human and animal bones, the strange regenerative qualities noted by early investigators, and the inexplicable markings, were more than just curiosities. They were elements of a phenomenon that could not be safely examined, contained, or explained within the framework of known biology. Whispers persisted that the laboratory was staffed by researchers who had either vanished or returned profoundly changed, their mental states fractured by exposure to the materials. Stories circulated of lights flickering in the building at odd hours, faint sounds of chanting or scratching echoing from the walls, and shadows moving in ways inconsistent with the physical structure. Local historians speculated that the remains retained some trace of the fifth, the entity the brothers had worshipped, that the unnatural energy or consciousness had persisted within the bones, making them unstable and dangerous. Attempts to photograph, catalog, or even touch the samples reportedly resulted in equipment failure, memory lapses, or sudden, inexplicable illness among those involved. This sustained secrecy and the tangible signs of continued danger reinforced the terrifying notion that whatever the four brothers had encountered, studied, or summoned was not confined to the past. It lingered, hidden from view, yet exerting influence through the land, the woods, and the preserved remains, a force so anomalous that even the scientific mind recoiled from engagement. To the residents of Haskell County and the few who had glimpsed fragments of the truth, the unstudied remains were not merely relics, they were a warning, proof that some mysteries, no matter how rigorously pursued, are meant to remain undisturbed. The forest, the cabin, the journals, and now the secretive laboratory formed a continuum of unsolved terror, a chain of events linking human curiosity to something older, stranger, and infinitely more patient, waiting beneath the roots for the next unwary soul to venture too close, reminding all who remembered that some forces cannot be catalogued, classified, or explained, only feared and avoided.